Lately, I've been trying to picture my great-grandmother sitting out by the fire, her hands moving in a rhythm older than time itself. Tiny, sinew-strung beads dancing between her fingers, forming intricate patterns, stories in color stitched into fabric. Each bead is a lesson, each stitch a connection to the past. Materials like sinew, a connection to the land. This is how knowledge was passed, how culture was preserved, how love was expressed. My name is Brittany June Gamble, and I'm honored to share with you the rich and resilient history of Indigenous beadwork, a tradition deeply tied to my own journey of cultural reclamation and identity. I'm Anishinaabe, born and raised on Treaty 29 land, with my ancestors hailing from the Aamjiwnaang First Nation, formerly known as Sarnia Band. I acknowledge that I currently reside on Treaty 3 land, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. Beading is more than an art form. It is a language of survival, a method of storytelling, and a tool of resistance. Each bead tells a story of a people, a place, a moment in time. Yet, like so much of Indigenous culture, this tradition was threatened by colonization, forced underground, and nearly erased. And yet, despite everything, the beads never stopped being strung. I'm excited to share this journey through time, through struggle, through resurgence, to understand how beadwork was once a thriving part of Indigenous life, how colonial forces attempted to suppress it, and how it has become a powerful act of cultural resurgence today. Long before glass beads arrived from Europe, Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island crafted beads from what the land provided: porcupine quills, shells, bones, stones. These materials were transformed into intricate patterns, embedded in regalia, wampum belts, medicine bags, and adornments, each holding a story, a purpose, a spirit. The Haudenosaunee wove wampum belts of their gleaming white and purple quahog shells, recording treaties and historical agreements. These belts were not just decorative, they were living documents, carrying legal and spiritual weight. The Métis, with their fusion of Indigenous and European ancestry, created floral beadwork, a stunning interplay of color and tradition. The Anishinaabe and Plains nations incorporated beads into their regalia, where each pattern was an act of identity, a declaration of who they were, where they came from, and what they carried within them. Beading was more than craftsmanship. It was ceremony. It was governance. It was a way of speaking when words were not enough. And then the beads were silenced. With the arrival of settlers came the disruption of Indigenous life. Beadwork, like language and ceremony, became a target of colonial suppression. In 1850, the Campbell Wampum Factory in New Jersey industrialized bead production, stripping the craft from Indigenous hands and reducing sacred wampum to settler-controlled commodity. Indigenous nations, who had once used wampum to govern themselves, were now forced to buy back what had been stolen from them. In 1876, the Indian Act in Canada criminalized cultural practices, banning Indigenous people from wearing traditional regalia. Beadwork, an expression of identity and spirituality, had to be hidden, practiced only in secret. The pain of cultural erasure deepened with the residential school system, where children were taken from their families and stripped of their languages, traditions, and artistic expressions. Many beadwork techniques and designs were lost in those institutions of forced assimilation. And yet, in the quiet of homes, under dim candlelight, some continued to bead. Elders taught their children in whispers, their fingers moving deftly, refusing to let the stories die. Today, Indigenous beadwork is not just surviving, it is thriving. Beadworkers across Turtle Island are reclaiming their craft, spreading new stories while honoring the old. Beadwork is not just an art, it is medicine. It is a way to heal intergenerational trauma, to reconnect with identity, and to mend what was broken. Judy Anderson created a piece, "Every Time I Think of You, I Cry," a beaded piece dedicated to her brother, a victim of the '60s scoop. The clear beads and cascading fringe symbolize the tears shed by families torn apart, a powerful testament to grief and resilience. In the digital age, beadwork has found a new home. Indigenous artisans are using Instagram, TikTok, and Etsy to share their work, educate the public, and reclaim their narratives. Darcy Everson, an Anishinaabe entrepreneur, has built a thriving business supplying traditional beading materials like porcupine quills and birch bark, providing that economic empowerment and cultural preservation can go hand in hand. But even now, the struggle continues. Fashion designers and mass production companies exploit Indigenous beadwork designs, divorcing them from their original meaning. Beads made by machines lack the stories, the spirit, the hands that carefully stitch them together. Indigenous communities are fighting for intellectual property protections, ensuring that sacred designs are not stolen and commodified without consent. I've been struggling to record this last bit as some of it does include a bit of self-reflection, so I do ask you to bear with me. So as I string each bead onto the thread, I feel the weight of history in my hands. Bead by bead, I trace a path back to my ancestors, the ones who beaded by firelight, who whispered teachings through patterns, who fought to keep their stories alive. But I also feel the weight of absence. My journey of cultural reclamation has been shaped not by the direct teachings of my family, my community, or my elders, but through books, academia, and YouTube tutorials. This truth sits heavy with me. I've learned so much about beadwork, its resilience, its stories, its role in governance and spirituality, and yet there is a hollow space where teaching should have been passed down through hands-on experience, through the warmth of shared knowledge between generations. Instead, I gather fragments, piecing together what was disrupted by the forces of colonization, residential schools, and the systemic erasure of Indigenous identity. I am not alone in this. Many Indigenous peers I've met on this journey have also been shaped by disconnection, seeking knowledge from institutions that were never meant to hold our truths. Because our families, too, were forced apart from theirs. We are learning, but not in the way we were meant to. And yet, in this grief, there's also something powerful. The fact that I'm learning at all, despite the odds, is resistance. The fact that I can choose to bead, to research, to reclaim is an act of resurgence. The beadwork I create now is not just a reflection of my identity, but a bridge between what was lost and what is being rebuilt. I have chosen to bead a medallion of a turtle encased within a medicine wheel. The turtle represents Turtle Island, the land that has always held and sustained our people. It is a reminder that Indigenous nations were here long before colonial borders, that our governance, our laws, and our traditions are rooted in something far older than settler maps. The medicine wheel that surrounds it speaks of balance, healing, and cyclical knowledge, the very things I am trying to find within myself as I navigate what it means to reclaim a culture that was kept from me. The wheel then meets in the heart of the turtle to remind us of the teachings and medicines that ground us. This project has not just been about beadwork, it has been about unlearning. I've had to unlearn the idea that culture is something you either have or don't have, that I'm somehow less Indigenous because I was not raised with these teachings. I've had to unlearn the colonial narrative that learning must come from institutions rather than from the land, relationships, and embodied experience. I have had to unlearn the isolation that colonization enforced, because even in disconnection, I'm not alone. I am one bead in a larger pattern, a story still unfolding. The seventh generation principle teaches us that every action we take must benefit those who come after us. And now as I bead, I think not only of those who will come 7 generations from now, but of the next generation, my own daughter. I do not want her to search for her identity the way I have. I do not want her to feel like a stranger to her own culture, learning teachings from passerbys instead of family. I want her to grow up knowing the feel of beads between her fingers, to hear the stories behind the stitches, and to carry her ancestors in every piece she creates. I want her to know that her culture is not something she has to reclaim. It is something that belongs to her, and something that cannot be taken away. Beading this medallion is not just an act of cultural expression. It is an act of defiance, of healing, and of sovereignty. The beads were never silenced. They were waiting patiently for us to listen again. As I bead, I'm not just creating something beautiful. I am weaving myself back into the fabric of my people. I am remembering, I am resisting, I am reclaiming, and most of all, I am making sure my daughter never has to wonder where she belongs. Miigwech, Nyawan, and thank you for listening.